a Minister of Indigenous Services.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I will be splitting my time with the Honourable Member from Vancouver Centre. Kwe unusakut, tanse hello, bonjour. I do want to acknowledge first that I am speaking to you here today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Indigenous communities, families, and friends are hurting. Emotions are high and the pain is real. For Indigenous people, the events this week may not be a surprise. It doesn't make it less of a shock or less painful. There is not a single community that isn't grieving today. The news that came from Kamloops last week has opened up wounds that were not closed even if people thought they were closing. And our thoughts at this time and actions must support the communities and families in recovering the truth so that they can continue to heal. You can't heal without the truth, as painful as it is. It's on the hearts and minds of all Canadians, and frankly, if it isn't, it should be. I know people are eager to get answers as to what the federal government will do, what we will do nationally, and what Canada will do. Let me say this clearly. We will be there for Indigenous communities that want to continue the search for the truth. Yesterday, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Services announced $27 million in funding to support the ongoing NCTR and to implement calls to action 74 to 76. This will fund support for survivors, their families, and communities across Canada to locate and memorialize children who died or went missing while attending residential schools. Indigenous governments and communities have always been empowered to decide what is best for their children, their families, their communities, and the Act is providing a path for them to fully exercise and lift up that jurisdiction.
From CANZUK International, I'm Mathieu Laveau, and this is the CANZUK Podcast. In this series, we will explore what closer ties between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom should look like. How can greater partnerships increase freedom of movement, free trade, and foreign policy cooperation between these four countries? To find out, I welcome the Honourable Minister Marc Miller, who represents the riding of Ville-Marie, le Sud-Ouest, Île-des-Sœurs, and Montreal, Quebec, and is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Services for the Canadian federal government and a member of the Liberal Party. Thank you for coming on the show. Merci d'avoir venu au plateau.
Merci Mathieu de m'accueillir.
So, Mr. Miller, many of us saw in the news about the tragedy of the Kamloops Indian residential schools in British Columbia, where the remains of 215 children were found. Can you tell us exactly what the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Action Plan is meant to do and how it addresses what happened in Kamloops, but also the trauma that First Nation people have experienced in other residential schools in Canada? What is your government doing to help those experiencing trauma from the past?
Yeah, and thanks, Mathieu, for this. This is a deeply profound issue for what we believe our country to be, and the reality of what it is and what it was. For many of us non-Indigenous people, this was a shock and news, whereas while it was equally shocking to Indigenous peoples, it wasn't something that was new, but the stark truth of and the finality of numbers, as well as the young age of those remains that have been found, are ones that really are deeply painful. And first and foremost for those members or survivors that and their descendants who have and suffer the effects of intergenerational trauma, which is a very important point in some of the reaction that we're seeing in deep, profound pain, but also very triggering for as you mentioned, there were many communities. There's a single Indigenous community that hasn't been deeply wounded and scars reopened by this discovery, and it's been immensely triggering for the last 2 weeks. And as you know, pain can express itself in many ways, and it has certainly and focused many minds on the horrible legacy of the residential school, which was there to take the quote unquote Indian out of the child and to quote unquote civilize. Devastating effects are felt today. The trauma, the mental health of many Indigenous peoples are certainly have been deeply affected. And then there are many survivors who still don't want to talk about this. The truth is so important to healing, but sometimes with all things psychological, they're immensely complex, but they're repressing the truth can also be an instinct for survival, but healing is not possible without that truth coming out, and this truth is very, very painful. So I've had many testimonials from Indigenous people that about their parents, aunts, uncles that went through this. There was always testimonial in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report detailed the atrocities that occurred in what is more properly characterized as labor camps. And that's something that isn't completely revealed yet. The entirety of the truth, names associated to bodies which we may never know, documentation. So there's been many calls to get more information, respectfully honor those that were taken from their families and never returned. But I have to acknowledge that those calls have differed from community to community and nation to nation as communities choose their own path. And what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tells us to do as a matter of truth, first and foremost, and then reconciliation, is respecting the place that the Indigenous communities have to have in telling us, the federal government, and correspondingly the provincial government, what to do when it comes to honoring these children and finding out more truths at these sites, so we don't go storming in, digging things up without permission and consent. And that is very important to frame this discussion, because the federal government will be there for any Indigenous community that has had a residential school on their site. And we work with the provincial government where those sites are not on quote unquote reserve to get answers, but it goes at the pace of the communities affected themselves. And that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tells us to do. So obviously the federal government has expertise in this, as well as the financial capacity, which we will bring. But again, there's some immediacy in the need, but there's also a need to have a longer term approach, as well as a very important aspect of providing increased mental health services and supports to communities that have been deeply affected, both in the short term and the long term. There's hotlines people can access, but over the long term, this is a longer path of healing that will be there with communities and to foster and I guess unlock the healing.
And speaking of the federal government, for our listeners, could you explain what the Federal Indian Act of 1876 was and how it ties into Canada's colonial history and how it still affects Canadian society today?
Well, it is a racist discriminatory document that defines identity, which a crown entity or a federal government or provincial government has no place defining for people who know who they are. Yet we have defined them, put them into reserves, and this is something the Indian Act has evolved over time, but it is based in an era that it was at its height of colonialism, and it is an instrument that continues to define the relationship between the federal government, notably, and Indigenous communities today. It is something that over time there have been many propositions, and many aspects of it have been phased out with legislation, and many calls to abolish it. The challenge in all this is one that has always been a challenge with our government: is how do you do this in a way that reflects what individual communities desire and need. And throughout history, there has been more than the Indian Act that has defined our relationship. There has been treaties, numbered treaties, principally throughout the prairies, unceded lands, principally out west, treaties that are of peace and friendship in the east, and other treaties defined principally through wampums and agreements of allyship with Indigenous communities, which we banded together to fight off common enemies. And those are ones that have gone in large part unrecognized or violated. And so when we talk about that relationship and I guess abolishing the Indian Act, the question is on whose question that poses itself is who dictates the pace. And fundamentally, when we talk about that, it has to be guided in principles where we recognize the relationships that pre-existed and how they have evolved and how they need to go forward. So that's a whole set of questions and that are imperfectly examined when we say to ourselves, the federal government must abolish. It certainly can't do so unilaterally, lest it create an even worse situation and be disrespectful to the needs of individual communities. There are a number of mechanisms that we have put in place over time. First Nations Lands Management Act, the Rights and Reconciliation Framework, where we have modern treaties, for lack of a better word, but this is how we term it, modern treaties emerging that put us on, and their attempt is to put Indigenous peoples on a level playing field with the rest of Canada. There are examples, obviously, in northern Quebec, but on the west coast, they're all ones that have to be done through long, extensive negotiations that go in and around, whether it's reparations, land claims agreements, recognition of rights and governance, and very important discussions in and around identity. It is immensely complex. There is no one size fits all solution, and the solutions that are often, they are hard. The solutions are hard, and they are hard for a reason, because they go principally through one of respect and relationship that has been mired by a legitimate lack of trust by Indigenous peoples vis-a-vis the federal government and provincial entities as well.
I want to talk now about just Indigenous people, but around the Commonwealth countries as well, including Australia, New Zealand, because they also have large Indigenous populations like Canada. Do you see how a CANZUK alliance perhaps can strengthen Indigenous rights, or perhaps create a forum for Indigenous people across these countries to come together and work on solving challenges in their communities, especially when preserving Indigenous languages?
Absolutely. I would hasten to say that often the solutions put forward have already been very well thought through by Indigenous peoples in Canada, and there's an immense amount of diversity. If I base my answer on the census, there are over 90 Indigenous languages in Canada, with ethno-linguistic cultural groups of about a dozen. So with roots in the same linguistic history and shared culture. They are unique, beautiful, and need to be respected from that perspective. So there are solutions, and often the solutions you'll see when you go into communities, they've been ones that are proposed, and communities have been fighting against governments to preserve, because when we spoke initially about the residential schools, but one of the missions of the residential schools was to pound out the languages, and people were beaten for speaking their languages, which are beautiful, complex, rich, obviously have existed before French and English were spoken on this land, and in many ways express ideas and concepts that are much more elaborate than both the languages I was given, which were English and French. That has not been recognized in the past, and there are many. I guess the most vital language in Canada is Inuktitut, and following, and in terms of First Nations, most likely Cree, Ojibwe, Oji Cree. They then decline into different levels of precarity, I guess, that fragility, that all have their specific needs. We've seen some, to your question, first of all, when we talk about the UK, we have to talk about the relationship with the Crown, which many communities still hold very high in terms of the relationship, which is very important grounding aspect of this, and recognizing that the Crown relationship does guide a number of the discussions we have. In some others, it doesn't. When it comes to, because we have to obviously talk about this in terms of the colonial legacy and the efforts to wipe out languages. When we talk about about Australia and New Zealand, there are always good inspirational work that has been done, and sometimes is ahead of Canada. There's amazing work that's been done with the Maori in New Zealand in preserving their language. Much more work to do. We have relationships with those governments, and I've certainly gotten a lot of inspiration from the person who is now the foreign minister for New Zealand, who is herself Maori.
And so now I wanted to move on to the subject of Quebec and its relationship with the other three countries. So do you see Quebec supporting free movement and trading relations between Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom? Or do you envision that the province will require provisions to get on board with the idea?
It depends. Again, it's when it comes to trading, obviously that is from an international perspective a federal responsibility. When it comes to barriers that are within the categories that are in the jurisdiction of the province in question, whether it's Quebec or Manitoba or BC, Alberta, those are ones that have to be, which can create barriers despite the agreements we as Canada have with our international partners. NAFTA obviously is the most explicit example, but the relationships with the Europeans as well. Quebec can impose de facto barriers to doing things. I've seen, unless you tell me differently, I haven't seen much hesitancy from Quebec's perspective. I think there is an opening of people's minds as to how that would take effect. Whether it's you have to look at the trading in commodities that flow between Australia, UK, and New Zealand. And they vary, but it is when we talk about language and culture, I think Quebec and its unique experience brings a lot to the table that can be very enriching. Preservation of language, is certainly one of them, particularly when those other countries have English as the main language spoken. When it comes to preserving Indigenous languages, Quebec, I think, sort of like other provinces, is recognizing the importance of preserving Indigenous languages. But I think the federal government has been in embodying this as an inherent right, recognizing that we have stolen it from Indigenous peoples or forced people to speak English or French. Recognize these rights as inherent through our recent legislation that was passed in the previous before the previous election in 2019 in terms of preserving Indigenous languages and putting funding forward. I think the point in all this is that in order to preserve Indigenous languages, it'll take a renewed, respectful relationship with Indigenous communities. There's I guess a dozen spoken languages in Quebec, perhaps more, and they do represent, the last time I checked, 25% of the Indigenous languages spoken as a proportion of Canada. That number is a bit shaky. I'd have to check that, but it's illustrative. So there's work to be done. First, I would highlight for your listeners that the province that has done the best job in that is British Columbia, and it's really doing some marvelous work. Now there's a huge number of languages that it needs to work on, but it comes with money, it comes with support, and that's what the federal government brings to the table. People are always surprised to know that in the Northwest Territories there are, I think, 11 official languages that can be spoken in their parliament. So pretty cool, pretty interesting thing for perhaps your listeners. But the point to remember is that there's work to do. When you see language vitalization in communities, more often than not, as I mentioned earlier, these have been done by people who are passionate about the beauty of their language and the need to transmit it on to the next generation, knowing that it's very, very fragile, and to create first language speakers. And that's always a huge challenge, because there's always a tendency to default to English or to French, and that's an ongoing struggle that they have been doing for generations. And all they ask for is support, financial support, and for us to get out of the way and allow them to thrive as they promote languages, but also reform their education system. One of the things we did, I know I'm going on, but it's important, and I do care a lot about this. One of the things that we did as a government was not only pass C91 on Indigenous languages, upholding that as an inherent right, but also fund that with hundreds of millions of dollars now per year, up from what was a tiny amount, a few million under the previous government. But there's much more to do. Also, key to all this is supporting communities in their K-12, so kindergarten to 12 education. And in recent budgets, we've announced $1,500 per student on reserve for language and culture to be done at the pace of that particular community. So these are positive things, but there's certainly a lot more work to do. And when you measure the vitality of languages, it's hard to measure it over a 4-year period. You kind of have to measure it over a generational period, so a 30-year period. And that is not politically expedient, but the reality of language transmission from generation to generation.
Speaking of language, as you said, Quebec is rightfully supportive of preserving the French language as part of its cultural and linguistic heritage. Although there are, many French speakers across the 3 countries, the CANZUK countries, there are obviously mostly English speaking. So in your view, do you think affording citizens of Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom greater living and working rights in Quebec would threaten the French language in the province? Or do you think it would be a greater way to open the province up and allow citizens of those countries to learn French and immerse themselves in Quebec culture?
Yeah, and maybe I'll answer in French for that answer. So, d'abord et avant tout, on sait qu'au Québec, l'importance d'apprendre la langue française, c'est la langue principale de la nation québécoise. Le Québec a fait un travail incroyable dans un océan d'anglais en Amérique du Nord pour préserver la langue française et la promouvoir. Parfois, évidemment, elle l'a fait de façon négative et sur le dos, évidemment, des langues autochtones. Donc, quand vient le temps de promouvoir les langues autochtones, par exemple, ça ne devrait pas échapper à qui que ce soit qui promouvoit la langue française, que les langues autochtones passent des moments très, très, très difficiles vis-à-vis des langues qui sont, somme toute, dominantes à travers le Canada, à travers le monde, c'est-à-dire le français, puis évidemment l'anglais. Donc, il y a une raison, puis il y a peut-être une lutte qui n'est pas dissimilaire, évidemment, les langues autochtones étant immensément plus précaires. Quand on parle des nuances qui existent à travers le Québec, évidemment, la forte minorité anglophone qui a des droits qui sont enchâssés dans la Constitution canadienne, qui se doivent d'être préservés. C'est la nature même de notre pays au Canada qu'on se doit de défendre les minorités linguistiques partout où elles se trouvent, mais aussi les langues autochtones au nord du Québec. Quand vous parlez du Nunavik, la langue qui est parlée, c'est l'Inuktitut. Et donc, la langue française, c'est vraiment la langue seconde ou troisième langue, mais l'importance de promouvoir ces langues et de les laisser s'épanouir. Et ceci étant dit, quand on a des projets de loi qui passent à côté ces nuances, je pense qu'on manque la délicatesse de ce que nous sommes, nous, Québécois. Oui, tout le monde se devrait de parler français, mais pas sur le dos des minorités, que ce soit linguistiques anglophones, évidemment, qui ont des droits enchâssés dans la Constitution, ou des droits inhérents des peuples autochtones qui ont souffert dans les écoles résidentielles administrées soit par l'État ou par principalement l'Église catholique, en forçant soit l'anglais ou soit la langue française. Donc, ça ne doit pas être perdu sur qui que ce soit que c'est la réalité de notre histoire. En ce qui a trait à la mobilité, puis la mobilité des ressortissants de la Grande-Bretagne ou de l'Australie ou de la Nouvelle-Zélande, c'est clair que nous avons au Québec une pénurie de main-d'œuvre qualifiée. Nous l'avions en entrant dans la pandémie, nous en sortirons évidemment avec la qualité de l'éducation qui existe dans ces trois pays. Très important de promouvoir ce transfert de richesse intellectuelle. Ça peut se faire sans miner, évidemment, la langue française, sachant que la langue de travail au Québec, principalement, évidemment, c'est le français. On en est très conscient au gouvernement fédéral en transférant des sommes qui sont très importantes au Québec pour promouvoir la francisation. Évidemment, c'est les résultats qui s'attendent. Évidemment, c'est quand les gens veulent s'établir avec une certaine permanence au Québec, c'est important qu'ils apprennent le français. On met des sommes à l'appui du gouvernement provincial pour ce faire. Mais on sait tout qu'au final, si on veut promouvoir une langue de qualité, la réforme se fait d'abord et avant tout dans l'école, dans le système public d'éducation en français, avec un enseignement de qualité en français.
Merci, Monsieur Miller. Donc, I want to switch now on the subject of foreign policy and trade because they are pillars of CANZUK. So there's little doubt that Canada's relationship with China has been strained over the recent years. Do you think that Canada should continue to engage with China bilaterally to rectify ongoing issues between our nations? Or do you think that there is value in Canada working with Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom to address these challenges?
First, we have to recognize that we have a very deep and complex relationship with China. First and foremost, with the Chinese people. Anyone walking around Montreal will see statues to Norman Bethune, who was one of the obviously doctors that treated some very sick people during the Long March. And this is a rich history of our country, not to mention a very, very vibrant community in Montreal, a very vibrant Chinese community, and a more modern expression of it as well in different parts of town. So our focus when we look at other nations is always on the people. We have disagreements with the regime in place, and we are not afraid of sharing those. We also have two people who are being unjustly detained, the two Michaels, in desperate conditions. So this is something that is a key element of our foreign policy. We need our allies to stand up with us, our like-minded allies, and that includes Canada, U.S., and Canada, the U.S. In particular, the U.K., Australia, and New Zealand, who have been vocal and been good partners on that. So it's a multifaceted approach. We believe we can deal with China and uphold our values and rights in a very firm fashion, knowing that, frankly, in terms of population, we are, in their minds, perhaps a rounding error. So that doesn't mean that we can't stand up for our right. We have consumer power. We have moral power in the world, And I think Canadians have seen that we're not afraid to express it.
And Mr. Miller, as you know, the UK and Canada are looking to create a new and comprehensive trade deal. What would you like to see as part of this upcoming deal? And do you think similar provisions could be applied to a deal with like Australia and New Zealand, and perhaps a multilateral CANZUK deal in the future?
Yeah, and these are always helpful. We're a trading nation. We like to say that we are the only country in the G7 with trade deals with every single other G7 country. It is true, and it is important to highlight that. The UK deal is very much sort of a vestige, I guess, of its exit from the EU. So mirroring provisions, and obviously, if we can get a better deal, that's great. And so it always helps. Trading relationships are always can be thorny, and with like-minded countries, sometimes we do have disagreements. But I'd certainly like to see cheaper prices on New Zealand wine. But or I don't know. I don't eat that much cheddar, but I'm generalizing. I certainly don't eat Marmite or Vegemite from Australia, so I think you can put huge trade barriers on that for all you want. But I believe in free trade, and I believe I believe in fundamentally in the value of comparative advantages.
And Mr. Miller, final question. So CANZUK has received cross-party interest in Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, whether it be with Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, Richard Marles, who is the Deputy Labour Leader in Australia, and many others. I know the Conservative Party in Canada, with the Erin O'Toole as the leader, have expressed major support for CANZUK, but has there been any interest amongst your colleagues in the Liberal Party, or has there been any talks about CANZUK and where it might progress in the future years?
We're very supportive. I mean, we've had a historical relationship that is whether it's through the Commonwealth and through our common experience of having descendants that hailed from a little island, and it is one that has evolved, and it is one that we continue in fostering. And you'll hear no objection. In fact, quite the opposite among the members of our government to enhancing that relationship. It is very much one that we cherish, and we rely on each other despite distances.
Well, Mr. Miller, merci for coming on the show.
C'est moi qui vous remercie.
Thank you for listening. Merci de nous avoir écoutés. Don't forget to follow CANZUK International on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And for more information on CANZUK, look up canzukinternational.com for more up-to-date insight on the current events surrounding this project. Till next time, à bientôt.